All right, Chapter 38, The Stormy Sixties, 1960 to 1968. One of the more entertaining chapters in this textbook. Let's get started. And a few key points here as always, right? Kennedy and Johnson both fight for civil rights directly. This is a change from previous administrations, which may have been involved with progressive reform, but not necessarily civil rights directly, at least not since Lincoln and Reconstruction. Also, we have a Cold War that now is going to span two continents, and be involved in two hemispheres. At the same time, we have a youthful, idealistic, strong, anti-authority, anti-establishment movement that emerges. These are baby boomers who are coming of age in the late 60s. And as it said in the text, the counterculture is going to weaken the grip of older values, perhaps permanently. President Kennedy was the youngest president to take office. He assembled one of the youngest cabinets as well, including his younger brother Robert Kennedy as the Attorney General, who planned to reform the priorities of the FBI. Kennedy pushed his new frontier plans, which included trying to fix unemployment and inflation and keeping wages high for workers. His plan inspired patriotism, and Kennedy actually also proposed the Peace Corps. Here is the Peace Corps logo. Very highly competitive organization to get into these days. And here's Bobby Kennedy. This is Jack's younger brother. All right, Southern Democrats and Republicans both despised the president's New Frontier plan. Keep in mind that Kennedy had campaigned on the theme of revitalizing the economy after recessions during the Eisenhower years, and part of his plan to do this was try to curb inflation. So in 1962, he negotiated a non-inflationary wage agreement with the steel industry. The steel industry actually announced significant price increases despite this. At that point, it was said in the text that Kennedy unleashed his Irish temper on them, and they backed down. Kennedy also helped stimulate the economy by cutting taxes and putting money directly into the hands of individuals. Again, sort of a New Deal idea, percolate up kind of concept. And he proposed a multi-billion-dollar plan to land American on the moon. This is the Apollo program, of course, which we are successful in 1969. Here is a photo from that. It's not a hoax, people. Just give it up. The Soviets wanted to prevent the drain of population from East Germany to the west through Berlin, so in 1961 they began construction of the Berlin Wall. Western Europe in general, was actually quite appealing as it was prospering as a result of the Marshall Plan and the growth of the European Economic Community, also known as the Common Market, or the ECC. This was a free trade area that evolved into the European Union. Now, Kennedy secured passage of the Trade Expansion Act in 1962, authorizing tariff cuts up to 50% to promote trade between America and the Common Market countries. American policymakers were dedicated to economically and military united Atlantic community, with the United States the dominant partner. Unfortunately, in 1963, Charles de Gaulle was a bit concerned about this, and he vetoed Britain's application to the Common Market membership. He feared that Britain's special relationship with the U.S. would allow the U.S. to indirectly control European affairs. Whatever happened to the Monroe Doctrine? Here is a map of the Berlin Wall. You can see here and again the four sectors of Berlin, which are consolidated into two. Iconic photo from the book of the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, 1989-1990. All right, 1954, Laos gained its independence from France and then erupted in violence. Kennedy avoided sending troops, and the peace was ultimately achieved at the Geneva Conference in 1962. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara began to push the strategy of flexible response, sort of a military response that was not solely nuclear. An example of that might be special forces, such as the Green Berets. Here's a map where you can see the old French Indochina. Laos obviously is in blue right there, next to Vietnam and Cambodia. And here is Robert McNamara on the cover of Time magazine. This doctrine of flexible response is obviously a de-escalation from nuclear warfare and so forth, but you could also make the case that it actually opened the door for fighting, as it was not as serious. In 1961, for example, JFK increased the military advisors in South Vietnam to protect the Diem regime from the communists. However, in 1963, Kennedy encouraged a successful military coup and killed Diem, as it was found that he was embezzling American funds. There's this modernization theory that is being kicked around at the same time as well, that these traditional societies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America could in fact develop into prosperous democratic countries by following America's lead. So, think white man's burden, think assimilation, sort of modeling these old societies after this new American way. 1961, JFK signed the Alliance for Progress, which is essentially a Marshall Plan for Latin America. Remember that folks like Castro were complaining that Americans were spending money in Europe and not so much in Latin America. Conservatives especially criticized this and said that the money would not actually help these Latin American countries. The goal was to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor, and therefore reduce the appeal of these new communist groups that are gaining power and prominence in Latin America. Speaking of Cuba and Castro, in April 1961, 1,200 American-supported Cuban exiles landed at the famed Bay of Pigs. This was an attempt to overthrow the Castro regime. Now, Kennedy was against the direct intervention of the overthrow of Castro, so he did not provide sufficient support for the exiles, and they failed. In October 1962, it was discovered that the Soviets were secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, and Kennedy ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba, and also demanded the immediate removal of the weapons. And we'll talk about this Cuban Missile Crisis on the next slide here. Here's a picture of these exiles, though, the defeated at the Bay of Pigs. All right, so for about a week now, Americans waited while the Soviet ships approached the patrol line, and I think the general fear was not if the attack came or if the atomic World War III began, it was when would that happen. But fortunately, on October 28th, Khrushchev agreed to a compromise in which he would pull the missiles out of Cuba, and as a result of that, Americans would end the quarantine and not invade Cuba, so they would be able to exist as they were. And this ends the Cuban Missile Crisis. Shortly after that, a pact prohibiting trial nuclear explosions in the atmosphere was signed by the Soviets and the U.S. And JFK begins to encourage Americans to consider this peaceful coexistence, to not look at the Soviet Union as bad necessarily. Now, I just read that this actually, not this particular, but the fact that the U.S. kept the European allies in the dark about this created some animosity between the United States and European allies as well. Here are some of the photos that were used to show that missiles were actually in Cuba. And here is a sort of blast radius or effective strike radius of these missiles, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. All right, so JFK did campaign on this idea of passing civil rights legislation. However, once in office, he was very slow to act. I suppose he didn't want to alienate any Southern support he may have had. And in 1960, we have groups such as the Freedom Riders who went to the South and tried to end segregation in facilities serving interstate bus passengers. They were attacked by local town police and so forth, as well as civilians. And federal marshals were actually dispatched to protect these Freedom Riders. Continuing with this idea of struggling for civil rights, we had the Voter Education Project, which sought to register the South's historically disenfranchised blacks. Keep in mind that in some of these southern towns, there were incredibly high percentages of African Americans, but extremely low percentages of registered black voters. In the spring of 1963, Martin Luther King launched a campaign against discrimination in Birmingham, Alabama. This was the most segregated big city in America. Some incredibly violent things occurred there. There were police dogs that were being basically turned on men, women, and children, as well as high-pressure water hoses used to knock protesters down and so forth. And again, this is a Martin Luther King demonstration, so it is a peaceful gathering and a peaceful protest. Kennedy delivered a speech to the nation on June 11, 1963, in which he dedicated himself to finding a solution to the racial problems. Example of the type of brutality that was used against protesters in Alabama. And of course, we have the March on Washington in August 1963, where 200,000 people gathered, black and white, to demonstrate for the cause of civil rights. And we have Martin Luther King here in the picture, seen addressing the crowd. This is where he delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Very inspiring, very powerful speech from a very inspiring and powerful person. November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy was shot in Dallas, Texas. He was riding in an open limousine. The alleged gunman was Lee Harvey Oswald, who himself was also shot on television by a man named Jack Ruby. President Johnson will be swearing into office just after Kennedy's death. He does retain most of Kennedy's cabinet. And Kennedy was praised for more of his ideals than what he actually achieved, as he's only president for a few years. Here is the car that Kennedy was riding in. You can see his wife sitting next to him. And here is the killing of Oswald by Jack Ruby. And another iconic photo of LBJ swearing in aboard Air Force One. Johnson's going to convince Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act 1964, which will ban racial discrimination in most private facilities that are open to the public. It also will strengthen the federal government's power to end segregation in schools and other public places. And it also created the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to eliminate discrimination in hiring in terms of race, national origin, and gender. In 1965, Johnson's going to issue an executive order requiring all federal contractors to take affirmative action against discrimination, and he's going to wage a war on poverty as well. But it's his domestic program, his Great Society, that might be what we know him best by, which was a New Deal style economic and welfare program, and it tried to reduce poverty and racial discrimination. The Great Society, as Johnson said, is a place where every child can find knowledge to enrich his mind and to enlarge his talents. It is a place where the city of man serves not only the needs of the body and the demands of commerce, but the desire for beauty and the hunger for community. It is a place where men are more concerned with the quality of their goals than the quantity of their goods. Again, so sort of putting pure profit on the back burner and looking at society with a different lens. Now, Johnson's a Democrat, and he'll run on his own in 1964 against Republican Barry Goldwater. Goldwater and the Republicans will attack the federal income tax, Social Security, the Tennessee Valley Authority, civil rights, nuclear test ban treaties, and just the Great Society in general. Now, as we're getting near the election in August of 1964, two U.S. ships were allegedly fired upon in the Gulf of Tonkin, and LBJ said this attack was unprovoked, and he used the event to get Congress to pass the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which basically gives the president a blank check to escalate conflict without congressional approval. And so it allows Johnson to use force sort of at his discretion without any declaration of war. This is probably going to help him in the election, and he wins overwhelmingly in 1964. Here's Barry Goldwater and this Republican conservative mind frame of what government should and should not be doing. And here's the election map, so you can see that the Democrats had a large majority here. So now Johnson's reelected. We could talk about that Great Society. In the War on Poverty, Congress gave more money to the Office of Economic Opportunity, and it created two new cabinet offices, the Department of Transportation and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and that department both of those are still around today. Also, the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities was designed to raise the level of American cultural life. Back to the HUD there, they do some interesting things. They really are about revitalizing urban centers and providing, access to loans for homeowners in cities to renovate, for example, or providing low-interest loans to people who are looking to buy a home in a city. So, again, it's about developing urban areas and improving them, just generally speaking. All right, here's LBJ's Big Four legislative achievements: education, medical care, immigration, and voting rights. With education, money was provided to students as opposed to schools. In terms of medical care for the elderly and the poor, we have Medicaid and Medicare, as you can see, in 1965. In immigration reform, we're looking at the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which abolished the quota system. Remember that, from 1921 and 24. And we have a new voting rights bill, which we'll discuss on another slide. I mentioned the Civil Rights Act of 1964 earlier in the presentation, but remember that it was passed and it allowed the federal government more power in prohibiting racial discrimination in public places, including schools, as you can see there. 1964, the 24th Amendment is ratified, which abolished the poll tax in federal elections, but obviously didn't do anything for local and state elections. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is going to attack that, and it will try to prohibit minorities from being disenfranchised or prevented from voting through these backwards and underhanded techniques like the poll taxes and literacy tests and so forth. And if you look at these two graphs here, you can see the impact of the Voting Rights Act as black registered voters increase dramatically in these southern states directly following it. So alongside Martin Luther King's sort of peaceful message of coexistence and appreciation, there emerges this idea of black power. And if you look down the bottom of the slide, you'll see the name Stokely Carmichael, and he's credited with sort of coining this phrase. And the text suggests that when it was created, it was more about racial pride and the creation of black political and cultural parties than it was full separatism. and in sort of the rejection of coexistence, which is what I would say it emerged or evolved into, excuse me. If you look at this photo here, you can see sort of the damage, the scope and size of the damage in the Watts riots in Los Angeles. And this was just days after the Voting Rights Act. From then on out, there's more militant confrontations during the black struggle and demonstrations that are advocating for civil rights. Malcolm X, this African-American Muslim minister, is going to be preaching this message of separatism in the interview that we will see in class. At no time does he ever suggest anything about coexistence or appreciation. In fact, he's still quite angry about slavery, and he's talking about the injustices that white Americans have caused black Americans from the beginning of our country. The Black Panther Party emerges as a militant group based largely in Oakland, California, I believe, also advocating for separatism. Here are two Olympians in the 1968 Olympics showing the Black Power salute. That's Tommy Smith and John Carlos. And here is an example of a Black Panther Party you can see here with armed guards outside. They do show a scene in Forrest Gump that sort of chronicles this and the type of activity that went on inside these meetings. April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was shot in Memphis, Tennessee on a balcony by a sniper, and he dies as a martyr for the cause of civil rights. And while that, of course, is a tragic loss, we do see improvements in terms of black voter registration by the end of the 1960s. And by the end of the 1960s, also, several hundred blacks held elected positions in the South. Here's a scene on that day. In April of 65, Johnson is going to send 25,000 troops to the Dominican Republic. He claimed that there was a Castro-like coup happening and that we needed to restore order. He was widely condemned for this, as the evidence he had was not all that great. In February of 1965, the Viet Cong Guerrillas had attacked an American air base at Pleiku, South Vietnam. And from then, or following that, Operation Rolling Thunder kicked up. This was the longest bombing campaign in American history. And LBJ thought that an orderly escalation of American force in Vietnam would defeat the enemy. It's pretty clear now that that was sort of a non-conventional war, and therefore conventional tactics such as this bombing campaign would have little impact. And you can see that, again, through 68 and 69, we have around 500,000 tons of bombs being dropped per year. It was virtually nonstop, as I understand. Now, the fighting in Vietnam is becoming more Americanized each year, and the pro-war hawks are fearing that an American pullout would lead to communism spreading. There's this idea called domino theory, that if one country were to fall to communism, then all the others around it would also be knocked down. So by 1968, there's over 500,000 American troops in Southeast Asia, and the annual cost of the war was over $30 billion. And you can compare that to previous wars. World War II is not on this graph, obviously, but it's far higher than Vietnam and Iraq, which you can see are the two highest, since Korea. All right, in June 1967, we have the Six-Day War between Israel and some of its surrounding neighbors. Israel actually gained territories in the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. And anti-war demonstrations will be increasing towards the end of the 60s significantly. Senator William Fulbright, in televised hearings in 66 and 67, convinced the public that it had been deceived about the causes and the winnability of the war. Defense Secretary Bob McNamara expressed discomfort about the war, and he was actually dismissed from office. But increasingly, especially after Tet, which we'll see in the next slide or so, students and young people especially begin to become very active in this anti-war movement. And obviously, you may know that a lot of that angst and anger and frustration that Americans had with the government and the war was unfortunately projected on returning soldiers and servicemen coming back from Vietnam. So we'll talk about that again in class. By 1968, the Vietnam War had become the longest and most unpopular foreign war in the nation's history. The text suggests the government didn't really explain why we were there. Casualties were high, and conventional methods were not working. We dropped more bombs, it said in the Pageant, in Vietnam than we did in World War II, and obviously the outcome is a very different outcome. In 1967, Johnson ordered the CIA to spy on domestic anti-war activists and encouraged the FBI to do the same thing, using its counterintelligence program to investigate members of the peace movement. All of that, by the way, sort of raises a lot of questions and concerns about the honesty and integrity of the government, and sort of like the legitimacy of what they're actually telling the American people. Similar to that, President Johnson had said on television that things were going well in Vietnam. And then in January of 1968, we have the Tet Offensive. Tet was the Vietnamese New Year. It was supposed to be a ceasefire. But during that time, the Viet Cong attacked 27 key South Vietnamese cities, including Saigon, simultaneously. And this ended in a military defeat for the Viet Cong. But again, it caused the American people to be extremely concerned about what's actually happening in Vietnam compared to what they're being told. And here's a map showing the simultaneous attacks that occurred during the Tet Offensive. Major turning point in terms of public opinion towards the Vietnam War. There are more doves after Tet than there were before. All right, Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy entered the race for the 1968 Democratic presidential nomination. At the same time, LBJ stated he would freeze American troop levels. He would gradually shift more responsibility to the South Vietnamese, the process of Vietnamization as opposed to Americanization. He would scale back the bombing campaign, and he declared that he would not be a candidate for the presidency in 1968. All right, June 5th, 1968, Bobby Kennedy was shot and killed. Hubert Humphrey, LBJ's VP, won the Democratic nomination then, and he actually supported the increased use of force in Vietnam, as did his opponent, Richard Nixon, the Republican. Don't forget, he made his name being tough on the communists. The Republican Party platform called for a victory in Vietnam and a strong anti-crime policy. So what you have is both parties supporting the Vietnam War. The American Independent Party called for the segregation of blacks, and despite winning most major cities and about 95% of the black vote, the Democrats lost the election, and Nixon will win in 1968. Here you have George Wallace, former governor of Alabama, who is the American Independent candidate running against Nixon and Humphrey, and you can see that the popular vote's actually pretty close. But the electoral vote gives the Republicans a pretty clear victory. Johnson made huge contributions to civil rights. Don't forget, his Great Society was a New Deal style program, but it explicitly did actively promote for equality amongst the races. The war, however, consumed a lot of tax dollars, and he offended both the Hawks and the Doves. The Hawks, the pro-war folks, and the Doves, the anti-war folks, because he did not want to continue to escalate the war. So the Hawks felt like he wasn't doing enough, yet he refused to end it, so the Doves opposed him as well. So when we talk about cultural upheaval in the 60s, we are talking about protests. For example, this free speech movement that began at UCal Berkeley in 1964, led by a man named Mario Savio. He actually criticized the impersonal university machine, but really it's a protest against the established authority. But it's more than just that. You can see, for example, that church is losing its grip on mainstream America, and the text says that between the 50s and 70s, educated people became more secular and uneducated became more religious. And these protests that we're talking about in America actually are happening globally. So you see in France and China and Czechoslovakia anti-government protests occurring. In the 1960s, there was also the sexual revolution, and the birth control pill made unwanted pregnancies easier to avoid. There was also an increase amongst homosexuals demanding tolerance as well in that decade. And the Stonewall Rebellion may have made this more of a national issue or brought it to the national attention. This is when some off-duty police officers had attacked some gay men outside of a nightclub. Worries about AIDS and other sexually transmitted diseases, the text said, did slow the sexual revolution. There's also an underground terrorist group called the Weathermen. These were students who were members of the Students for a Democratic Society group. You want to think about why there was such upheaval in the 1960s, think about the 3 Ps. There's a youthful population bulge, there's protests against racism in the Vietnam War, and the apparent permanence of prosperity, right in the middle of the 2 decades of economic prosperity and growth. Wow, that's it for 38. We only have 4 more chapters in the American pageant, getting closer to May 11th, but as they say, it'll be fine. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or let me know in class. Take care.